And welcome back to the first segment of our show this morning. We have been joined, as I mentioned prior to the commercial break, by representatives of the Statistical Institute of Belize. To my left, we have Dr. Leopold Perriott. He is the Director General of the SIB, and he is joined as well on the couch by Tiffany Vasquez. She is the Statistician 2 of the Economic Statistics Department of the SIB. And to my right, we have with us Jefte Ochaeta. He is a statistician with the Economic Statistics Department as well, and he's joined on the right by Wendy Benavides. She is the Statistician 2 for Census Surveys and Administrative Statistics Department. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
We were fortunate to have been able to attend a press brief with you guys in last week, where recent figures were shared with the media in terms of Belize's current performance. Statistics is one of those areas where I guess for us to be able to preface our conversation this morning, it's perhaps a bit challenging for you guys to generate that kind of an interest for people to understand numbers and figures and an overall outlook. Where would we begin from in terms of discussing Belize's performance so far from an economic perspective? Let's start with you, Dr. Perriott.
Well, I think first of all, the numbers have to tell a story. Okay, and that's the main, and that's the difficult part, as a matter of fact, to tell a story from the numbers perspective. And that's why we have these young, bright minds here. You know?
Yeah.
I would probably, I think one of the things that really hit us is, for example, the trade statistics. That's something that can tell a story. How much stuff we use, how much stuff we sell, how much stuff we bring in. You know, what it is that we produce, basically. And Tiffany is a trade statistician here in our hands, so she can probably elaborate a bit more. But I think it's the first place to start, the trade. And then the other place to go is the consumer prices, how much this stuff actually affects us. The prices go up, they go down, things of this sort, and we only earn a certain amount of money per month, and how does it affect us? It's a story you have to tell. Okay? The GDP is a little bit more tricky. That deals with the country as a whole, to tell us how the country as a whole is doing. But there is a story also to tell. And I think the important thing is to be a bit inventive to come up with a story that really tracks the numbers that we have.
And I think the best place to start is your data is as reliable as the inputs that you have.
True.
And so you're very reliant, not just on the work that you do internally at SIB, but also from those who provide information. So talk about where you've gathered the numbers to put together the trade statistics.
Okay, well, for trade statistics, we are very fortunate. We have an excellent relationship with the Customs Department. So monthly, we download our data from Customs, and that is also backed up directly by industry data. So our major industries that we provide all of our major exports from, those come directly from the industry themselves. So we're extremely lucky. And so it's reliable, so we have full confidence in our data.
And so talk to us about what you do measure.
So, well, for trade, we look at imports. So we look at all imported goods coming into the country, and we look at domestic exports, or domestically produced goods, and those that are exported out of the country. And we also have been recently looking at our merchandise trade balance, where we take the total exports that come into the country, and that is subtracted from the total imports that come into the country. But the thing is, though, with our merchandise trade balance, we have to be very careful, because sometimes we look at our merchandise trade balance and we say, oh, it's only imports and domestic exports, but it's so much more than that. Because, for example, for exports, it has to be our domestically produced goods, and it has to be our re-exports. So all the goods that were imported into the country but were later exported out of the country, right? And for imports, the same thing. It's all the goods that were imported into the country, but we have to look at re-imports, which is a very, very small value.
Can I ask a quick question while you're there?
Sure.
What do you mean by items or products that are brought in and then re-exported? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, for example, imports that are brought into our commercial free zones. Those are, at some point, they come for the purpose of being re-exported. So we have to include that data because we would be under the assumption that all goods that came into the country were consumed by the country, and that is not the case. Some of it were actually re-exported out of the country. So if we were to leave it and just say imports and domestic exports, that gap will be very big. So we have to take out our re-exports and our re-imports and then look at the gap, right? So that is something we have been looking at, and in the future we want to really do a nice trend over the years to see how that gap has widened over the years.
When we look at the figures either on a quarterly or on a biannual basis, I think most people gravitate towards finding out the import-export ratio and the consumer price index. I think a lot of people want to know, okay, well, what's the cost of living like in terms of being able to afford certain products that are consumed locally? Is it then a trend that for the most part we are more importers than we are exporters when you look at the numbers?
We are. We import significantly more than we export. Significantly more, and that has been the case for a while now. I mean, if you look at, for example, if you just look at from the year 2010 to the year 2015, it's like almost like a straight path. It peaked at 2015 and then it started to fall a little after that. From 2015 to about 2017, and it rose again to 2016. So it's like that. But at the end of the day, it's an increase over the years.
Yeah. Now let's I wanted to talk a bit about the exports or our own exports that we have, because we've talked so many times about the different challenges in our traditional industries or agricultural industries, but we're actually seeing an upward trend with this latest report, right? When it comes to bananas.
That's for bananas, but then for bananas you have to be a little bit careful. That is the result of it's like a little rebound from last year, because last year within the early months, for example, I don't know if you remember, but for January 2018 we had significant rains and we had cold weather, so that affected the crop, the banana crop, in the first few months of last year. So we're comparing the first few months of this year with last year. So it is an increase. It's an increase of $6 million, but that is just more of a recovery.
So because it's relative to the downfall last year.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Now let's talk about some of the promising data that came out of this particular, when we're talking about trade, whether import or export, what are some of the promising results that you've seen? Well,
promising, I would have to point to marine exports. We had a small, it's not a major increase, it's an increase of $2.3 million, but it is an increase and it's positive, no? So we saw greater exports of conch and greater exports of shrimp, and that is both in terms of quantities and value. It's not a major increase for shrimp, but it is an increase. And to me, what I saw that really made me happy was exports to the CARICOM. Exports to the CARICOM region increased, and that was because we have now been exporting a little bit more sugar to the CARICOM region. And with the newly introduced crude soybean oil, that has done well. So that's a positive.
I have two questions going back to your mention of exports in the marine sector, so to speak. Is it to say then that we have fully recovered from the disease that was affecting the shrimp industry? That's one. And secondly, in respect of conchs, there have been concerns of overfishing. Would that perhaps be owing to the number of or the increase in the export of conchs?
All right, well, let's start with shrimp. The shrimp figures are nowhere where they used to be. Nowhere at all. I mean, it has plummeted, to be honest with you. But as I said, it's just, for example, within the January to May 2018 period, that value was 0.9 million. And for this period, it is 1.9 million. So it's almost a $1 million increase. So they're improving, but nowhere near the figures of the past. And for conch, you have a specific quota. So they cannot exceed that quota. But then the thing is, probably the frequency of the fishing just occurred a little bit earlier this year than last year. So those numbers at the end of the day, because you have to remember with, especially with shipments, they're highly dependent on the timing of shipments, right? So at the end of the year, these things should balance. So you would not see such a significant increase over that of last year, unless you had excellent prices on the market externally.
Now, the relativity of how you compare your statistics is important for people to understand, and it's going to help us in some of the other areas as well. Because when we hear up or down, sometimes people look at the figures and say, well, that can't possibly be true. We're not doing any better. We're not paying any less. And especially when you talk about consumer price index, which we'll get to shortly. So how do you explain to people who are, you know, they don't really pay attention to statistics. They just pay attention to what's happening around them, how to interpret the information that is put forward?
Yeah, well, as Dr. Perriott said, the story is very important. So we release these numbers, but we put a lot of effort into our press releases, and we make sure that these explanations are clear and written in simple language that everyone could understand. Because as you said, people will take the numbers and say, hey, this increased by so much, or this decreased by so much, but the story behind it is very important. So we take a lot of time to try to explain that at the end of the day. Right?
And because you also do the comparative analysis between the previous year or sometimes the previous quarter. And
sometimes the previous year, the previous quarter would have challenges, and then so this quarter you would see an increase and say, hey, things are doing great, but it's just a recovery. You know, so we have to be clear.
Do you want to respond to that, Dr. Perriott, when you think of?
It seems that what we do as a practice is to compare period to period. So January this year to January of last year. The reason for that is sometimes the processes follow a time, have a time. Sometimes people buy more stuff in a particular month. And so it'd be incorrect to say compare January of the year to February, because January is a time when people buy a lot, Christmas, right, New Year's, and then maybe February they don't have any money. And so when you look at it, they might say, oh, people are, this income is crashing or something like this. You see? And so we tend to compare point to point. So last year December to this year December. Last year March to this year March, and this is how we do it. And this is specifically to get over the issue of time, the time differences, what occurs in particular time, the seasonality of the issue.
And even though it's seasonal, there are anomalies that may take place each year, whether it is the bacteria infection at the shrimp farm, if there's a storm that passes through, if there's an election cycle, I imagine you see changes as well, right?
If they ship at the different months or something like this, then you have a problem. Sugar happens all the time. Sometimes sugar ships by bulk. And then of course it's a massive stuff, right? But then sometimes it doesn't. And then we have these issues.
Do you find that there are specific cycles or patterns when you compare based on periods, times of year?
Yes, there seasonality is a fact of life for the trade is a fact of life. The CPI is a fact of life. You know, this is what happens. People do things in seasons. You know. As I pointed out, in December, if you look at the graphs, they're very, very, very clear. And you look at the graphs, you know, December is a high point for sales. You know, people buy stuff. And then, of course, there's a low season, then there's a high season. When we talk about the trade, it works for the trade. It works for the CPI also. It works for the labor force. You know, there's a high season when people hire plenty, and there's a low season when people don't hire so much, and so the unemployment rates does all kinds of funny stuff. But people say, impossible, that stuff isn't true. Because just yesterday you told us, well, you told us that it was this high, now you're telling us it's dropped to this low. It can't never be true.
And you're looking at stuff, if you're looking at labor, perhaps this is your area of expertise, correct? Okay, fine. So let's get into the conversation.
Because that's the key indicator, I think, that stood out to a lot of people after that presentation.
Would we say then that, to support what Dr. Perriott is saying, that the fluctuations perhaps are owing to tourism, for instance, where you have a high and a low season, you need more hands on deck at a certain time of year as opposed to others, and areas of construction where you have ongoing development and then you have a lull or what have you? What would you attribute that to?
Yes, these are areas that tend to fluctuate depending on the season and depending on the time that we're in the field. So that contributes to the factor of unemployment rates increasing or decreasing. So that's a major factor.
So the definition of the labor force is who?
The definition of the labor force, well, that consists of persons who are employed, who have a job or were temporarily absent, or those that don't have a job but are available. So they're not just at home, sitting at home. They must be available to work. So those persons make up the labor force.
And how do you compile your statistics as to who's employed and unemployed?
Well, we have a series of questions where we filter out these persons and we group them based on how they respond to these questions.
And this is done across the country. How do you canvass the entire country to get those figures?
Well, we sample a total of 2,800 households, which must be representative of the entire country in both urban and rural areas.
Now, what came out of the last press conference is that you're saying that the unemployment rate is at a record low.
Yes, it is.
Can you explain that to us?
Well, we saw major impacts in 3 different districts. We saw Belize district overall that had gains in employment, specifically in the tourism industry. We also had declines in the labor force in Cayo district. These are mostly females that would tend to not be available for work anymore. Right? They have to take care of their children, or maybe they went back to school. Right? And a major impact also in Stann Creek, where the tourism industry also increased.
So that's a key point that you spoke of in Cayo, where you're saying that when a female or a woman decides to stay home with her child, she's no longer counted as a part of the labor force. So someone staying at home with their child is actually taking away from what would have been an unemployed person otherwise.
Right.
Yeah. What are some of the other reasons to account? So yeah, I hear tourism being as the main driver for people gaining employment in these areas. Any other information that you've been able to gather?
The other industry that affected was close to tourism was wholesale and retail trade and agriculture. That is always the major employers in the economy.
Yeah.
You see, for unemployment, for the labor force, well, the population has to be 14 years and older.
Yes.
Okay, and so you divide it up into people who are in the labor force and people who are not in the labor force.
Yeah.
People who are not in the labor force are, I'm aspiring to be one of those people, by the way, to be unemployed and don't want a job.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
While you're in the labor force, if you're employed or if you're looking for a job, if you're available. Okay. So then when you calculate you can get low unemployment rates by 2 means. Either there's a lot of jobs become available, which is what happened in Belize and Stann Creek, as far as we can tell. And that's one way. You have plenty of jobs being created, and so the unemployed people become employed. And so the unemployed people numbers go down, and so then you have the unemployment rate go down. That happened in Belize, that happened in Stann Creek. On the other hand, you could have that people who are unemployed becoming not in the labor force. That seemed to be what happened in Cayo. And so the unemployed people were no longer unemployed, they were not in the labor force, and so they couldn't be used in the calculations.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the unemployment rate also fell.
Why is the age set so low, though? You mentioned 14.
I think it has to do with some of our laws. Or some of our laws that, you know, you can start working if you're 14 and over. In other places, it's 15 and above.
Yeah.
Okay, but in our, we have special special way to do things like Belize, I suppose.
Yeah. You can work at the age of 14.
Yes, and or education, the laws for education tells us that we have to be in school until 14. It doesn't say 15.
Mandatory education is still 14 as well. But how do you differentiate between seasonal work and full-time employment? Because especially with tourism, it tends to be seasonal.
Right. Well, we have different areas in tourism. We have food and services, and we also have the hotel industry. And based on tourism arrivals, we have cruise ship that is at its highest. So that is what boosts that industry as well.
And when you look at the people who are employed, what are we looking at in terms of the breakdown between age and gender?
In terms of unemployment?
In terms what? Unemployment or employed, whichever one.
Okay, we have participation rates. For females, it's about 58% compared to the males, which is the majority at 80% of all employed males in the industry. So we see a difference there that males tend to dominate the labor force.
That has always been for quite some time, that the males were always more active in the labor force than the females. The gap is closing, by the way. I noticed that.
I'm trying to understand it properly. So when you say 80%, it means of the sample population, the 100% that were eligible to be in the labor force, they all want jobs. 80% of them are employed. Is that what you're saying?
No, 80%. It's not all males. It has to be in the working age population. So the working age population is 14 above. So out of those, 80% are participated in the labor force, which means that they could have been employed or unemployed at the time of the interview.
Okay. Versus 58 for women.
For women, yes.
That's interesting. All right. And what about age?
In the age groups, we see basically the same behavior within males and females. We see in the age group 14 to 24 having the highest unemployment rates for both males and females.
In any particular district?
That's across all districts.
Yeah.
Let's get you.
But before that, I want to get the district breakdown as well, because at one point, Cayo had one of the higher unemployment rates, right?
It has still, even though it dropped, it still has the highest unemployment rate.
Second too? I mean, who's second?
Second right now is Sand Creek District.
Yeah, Sand Creek at 9.1. I'm looking at your graph. You
Yeah,
see, so
I can see it. My graphics are behind me this time. Yeah. So these are all things, and I think it's important for people to know, because especially with projects that are developed, these are the kind of information that they want to look at. Now, how do you, same question in terms of trade, how do you process this type of data? When you say something to the country, like the lowest unemployment rate on record, that seems that paints a picture that things are really doing well in the country. We know we've struggled with stories, at least, of people who have been struggling to find jobs. How do you present this to the public and have them understand the dynamics as to how the numbers are put together and how realistic the picture is that's being painted?
Well, it's either or, basically. If more jobs have been created, then it's a big positive.
Yeah.
Okay. How many jobs were created in net? Was a bit over 8,000 jobs.
8,500.
500 jobs were created.
Yeah.
Net. Some jobs were lost and some were increased, but the net, the amount was 8,500, about that. Okay. Now, that seemed to have been sufficient to kick the unemployment rates down. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if enough people leave the labor force, that is also going to kick the unemployment rates down, and that isn't good. You don't want that. You want people to stay.
You don't want a smaller labor force.
You don't want a smaller labor force. You want as big a labor force as possible. So when people leave the labor force, that isn't a nice thing to happen.
Yeah.
And this is what we think happened in Cayo.
Because you're saying they're of productive age. That's what I'm you don't say it, but that's what I'm understanding. Like they are eligible to work. You're not talking retirees or under 14.
Well, that is exactly correct. That there will be retirees and people like me who want to do that. But there will be a lot of people who were unemployed, who are classified as unemployed in the labor force, who might have moved from that position to being out of the labor force. And this is something we have to take very carefully. We have to check this very, very carefully because this has some really serious ramifications as to the numbers. Okay, but that's what seemed to be, as far as we could tell, that's what seems to be happening this time around. It's a work in progress, to be sure.
Yeah. All right, so what we got to do, we got to talk about the consumer price index as well. But what we'll do is take a very quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue that conversation. So please stay tuned.
For over 20 years, Great Belize Television, Channel 5, has been the leader in award-winning local programming. We have also produced some of the best video commercials, documentaries, and live events for clients countrywide. And we continue to offer high-quality production services to maximize your advertising needs for your business or organization. From concept to completion, let us help you achieve your marketing goal by producing your commercial, documentary, graphic animation, live event, or even designing your website. Using state-of-the-art equipment and experienced personnel, we can make your ideas come alive. For more information, come see us on Coney Drive or give us a call at 223-0146 or 223-7781 or email us at gbtv@btl.net. Great Belize Productions, making great television in Belize.
We're back and we're continuing our conversation with representatives of the Statistical Institute of Belize. If you're just joining us, we have on set with us Dr. Leopold Perriott, who's the Director General. We have Tiffany Vasquez, Statistician 2 for the Economic Statistics Department, Jefte Ochaeta, Statistician 1, and Wendy Benavides, Statistician 2, all from SIB. So we talked a bit about trade, we talked a bit about the labor force, and now Jefte, you're going to break your silence today and talk to us a bit about our consumer price index, right?
Yes. So the consumer price index basically measures prices from a basket of goods, which was compiled from the Household Expenditure Survey of 2008.
Yeah.
This basket composed 260 products of goods and services that are consumed by Belizean households as reported through this survey. So what we do for us to derive our numbers, likewise like the survey of the LFS and the labor and the exports and imports, we do a survey on establishments. And we look at the 280 products that we have derived from the basket, and we go and survey these stores throughout the country, with the exception of San Pedro and Benqueviejo, just urban areas, because our money is short, right? So that's what we do, and then we compile the numbers, we derive the indices, and we compare it to the base year, which we developed for 2011.
Why do we exclude San Pedro and Benqueviejo?
Well, first of all, it has implications to our financials. We do not have enough resources and manpower when that was done. Yeah. Otherwise, we could have included if we had enough, right? And then we also have the ideology that San Pedro follows the consumer price index of Belize.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Benqueviejo, the one from San Ignacio. Yeah.
Fair enough.
So that's what we do. Then we prepare the numbers and we compare it to February of 2011, which is our base year. So for May of 2019, we are seeing that the prices have marginally declined. So there's a marginal decline, which is very, very small, of almost 0.1%, which means that from the 280 goods and services, prices went up and some went down, that they basically net themselves out. So they offsetted everything, decreases and increases. That doesn't mean that there weren't increases.
Yeah.
So in some of the categories, for example, food and beverage products, we recorded an increase of 0.5%. That meant that some food products increased. For example, meats were up, some fruits and vegetables were up also. But there were categories like transportation that went down by 1%.
Can we explore that one further? Because
Transportation?
I know
So,
filling up your car doesn't seem like it's actually going down, but that's what your statistics are saying.
yeah, so transportation for the month of May went down because we had we recorded a 5.9% decrease in transportation by air. And also we had a minimal decrease in fuel and lubricants of almost 1%. So those were the two main drivers of the decrease in the transportation industry. Even though it doesn't feel like prices have not decreased for fuel prices, compared to May of last year, they did decrease marginally.
And I always think that's one of the indicators that people look at and don't quite understand. Air travel is always fluctuating, and that's not based on us, that's based on the global market. And that can heavily trigger, or that can influence what we have as our statistics for transport. Do you assign a particular weight, understanding that what happens in Belize has no implication or very little implication as to what will happen with the cost of your airplane ticket?
Yes, like I mentioned earlier, the consumer prices is based from the household budget survey of 2008. So the 280 products, goods and services that were derived have a weight. Because those were the items that had the highest spending reported by consumers in Belize. So the spending reported basically creates the weight that will be assigned to each product. So these products have weights. So similar to what you mentioned, the transportation by air has a weight compared to the fuel expenditure. It has a different weight. Now, the fluctuations of prices based on market demand, that's part of the what consumers spend. So that also has to be taken into account in the measures. So yes, right now prices have shown a decline in airfare, but probably by later in the year, like November, December, you will see an increase in prices because of the demand also. So it will net out again at the average annual inflation, but we have weights that we follow for each of our products.
When you look at the basket, you've mentioned that there are 280 items that have been considered. Do you find that there are specific trends in terms of either items coming off that list or being added to that list? Is there any kind of fluctuation there?
Well, these 280 goods and services we have retained since 28.
Okay.
We have not changed them yet. Even though, yes, we have identified some products that and services that are not consumed as they were when the survey was taken. So that is why in 2018-19 we had an initiative at the SIB that we did a household budget survey to revise these baskets of goods and services. So hopefully by the end of this year we'll have a revision of the basket of goods and services, which will serve us as the baseline to create a new series for the CPI.
And the household budget is looking at how people spend their money.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily what we think people are spending their money on, like you'd think they'd pay rent and food. It's really going down into the house and finding out how they spend whatever money they make.
Exactly.
I want to talk a bit about housing, because that's also one of the indicators that showed a decline. And I know I've been seeing people complaining about their electricity rates, electricity bills. So it's one of the things I wanted us to dive deeper into the numbers to understand a bit more. In fact, when you look at the housing, the general category, it's actually home rentals that has caused the decline. There was a significant decline there?
There was a significant decline of home rentals of 1.2%. Even though there was increase in electricity tariffs, which were reported at 11.9%.
And this is before the actual increase that's been approved by PUC?
Yes.
Because this is up to May.
Up to May, yes. And then we also had an increase of almost 0.4% in the prices of liquefied petroleum gas, which is butane. But again, this is where the weights come into place.
Yeah.
So our home rental cost has a heftier weight
Yeah.
compared to electricity in the household budget. And makes sense, right? Because a house
Costs more.
costs more. So that's why this indicator is always one of the major ones that move the category of the housing and other utilities.
And what accounts for that decline of 1.2%?
Well, if I'm correct, just let me see my notes.
Yeah.
In Dangriga town, we recorded an overall inflation of minus 5.4%. And in this municipality is where we found lower prices recorded for homeowner rentals. So that's why this netted out the decrease in the overall home rental costs for the country. Yeah.
That seems to make more sense now.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of the other statistics under the Consumer Price Index.
Yes, so another interesting thing, like I mentioned earlier, is the food and beverages category, which increased by 4.5%. Even though people might say that they're feeling more, less, they're getting less for what they are paying.
Yeah.
Right? But again, it goes back to our basket of goods and services that we're studying. So we identified some of the products in food and beverages that increased. For instance, we saw a lot of red meats increasing their price. For instance, the price of beef steak went up by 8.6%. That's marginal. The price of ground beef went up by 9.7%. Some vegetables went up significantly, like sweet pepper went up by 9.6%. The price per pound, but there were also some that went down, like red kidney beans that went down by 4.7%. So these products tend to fluctuate, and they will offset one another. So even though there are some high increases, there might be some very low decreases, and they would offset one another. So this is one of the actual, one of the actual statistics that is of interest, because this is what actually households can actually look into and see how the food index is moving, because this is the one that has high implications to how they spend their money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the points that was raised during last week's press conference that really struck a lot of us in the media is the consumption of beer on the local market.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yes, just give me a second and I'll speak to that. So that's with regards to the gross domestic product. Sorry, my phone is messing up. So the overall the gross domestic product, we try to measure the produced goods and services in Belize, right? And we take into account what is imported and what is consumed and what is also sold abroad. So sorry, my phone is not working. It's where I have my notes. But for the first quarter of 2019, we had an increase of 5.2%, I believe, in the overall GDP. That means that we produced more goods and services for the first quarter of 2019 compared to 2018. Two of the major sectors that increased were agriculture and services. Manufacturing, which is a secondary sector, mostly decreased due to some factors that I'll share with you right now. So I was mentioning that the primary industries increased significantly. They increased by $11.4 million compared to the first quarter of 2019, as we saw an increase in agriculture and fishing, as shared by Tiffany. We had some recoveries and more sales in the export market of conch. The agriculture production was increased due to banana and sugarcane, which were at good numbers, at 22% increase in banana and 16.4% increase in sugarcane.
Yeah.
The secondary sector, which is what you're asking for, we had a decline of $5.1 million, or 4.7%, even though there were increases in the manufacturing and mining industry, which increased by $1.5 million. We saw an increase in beverages of 3.8%, which is the one that you want to understand. Yes, so the beverage production that we measure is soft drinks and beer, right? Because that's the local production.
Yeah.
So in the local production, we saw that beers increased by 4.4% and soft drink by 2.9%. So that's an overall, basically, about 70,000 gallons more produced of beer in January to March of this year compared to January to March of last year. Yes, my colleague shared that the rationale for this is the market demand, which is correct because otherwise the companies would not be producing more if they do not have market demand for the product. And that correlates with the high rise in the tourist visitors. Because the more visitors, the more the product you want to sell.
And that's always a continuous challenge that I think we always end up rounding off this conversation with, which is how, I mean, there are certain assumptions that are made, but no one really cross-referencing the data between increase in alcohol production and cost of airfare and number of tourists coming in. And you know, we keep on saying it, hoping that some of the educational institutions will perhaps see this as something that they can pursue even more. I know they do some research. But speaking of educational institutions, there were two, and we're getting ready to close off the conversation, but there were two indicators that stood out to me. One was the increase in education, and I'd like to understand that more. That was a 3.3% increase in terms of the cost of education, and I'd like to understand what accounts for that.
Well, I don't have the information available right now, but I could share the information with you when I reach Leopold. Okay. Yeah, sorry about
but
that.
is it, I mean, what is included in the cost of education? Tuition, fees, books?
It's education, fees, and books.
Yeah, and that's not even the start of school season. January to May is actually your second and third semester. Yeah. The bigger cost is September,
yes,
when people
so normally
first enroll.
That's one of the indicators that you would want to study, isolate them, so that you can see the seasonality in that period.
The second is that while we talked of an overall inflation rate of 0.01 overall for the country, and you said that there was a decrease in Dangriga, there was also an increase in Punta Gorda of over 3%. What happened to our friends from the south that we are seeing that kind of inflation?
I don't remember right away because I have to ask the statistician that prepared, but I can send you the information. But I believe it has to do with food prices. But if you were to make some assumptions, it has to do with food prices. Would be food prices, fuel costs, and taking it down. That's one of the things, taking goods down to Punta Gorda. It's food prices, and I believe it's home rental costs also. Home rental, okay. All right. Now, before we close off, I know there are big things happening with SIB as well. We are in the census period, which is a very important time. We look forward to the information, and you put in a lot of work to get the information out. Where are we now with the preparation of the latest census?
Well, as you know, the census is scheduled for next year, May. And so we've been working at it from 2016. So we've been at it for a little while. And right now we're in the process of putting maps together. So we're in the process of mapping the entire country. We're currently finishing up in San Pedro. So we send a team out there, and they go around taking pictures and doing all kinds of really strange things. And the next step after that is to map Belize City. And so after that, we've had all the urban areas will be mapped. We do have a good prospect to get maps from Mexico, from the Mexican Institute of Statistics for the rural areas. With a bit of luck, by October or so, we should be finished with the mapping, or almost finished with mapping.
When you say mapping, you're doing georeferencing this time,
yes,
too,
it's
right?
going to be. It's going to be. We're trying to identify each household. Every household that's visited, and every building that's available. So we're trying to put a GPS coordinate on each of these structures, each of these entities, so that we can, and it's very important, because when we do the census, we have a lot of information. How do you put that into maps?
Yeah.
And that's a big thing right now, to put this information in maps, to link up maps with statistics.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing going on right now. The other big thing is that we're in the process of finalizing our questionnaire. So I think we have passed them to our stakeholders to look at, and we plan to have a meeting with them sometime this month, maybe late this month, to come up to a consensus what the final questionnaire is going to look like. Because we do want to pilot.
Because you have quite a number of partner agencies who try to get information in the census questionnaire as well.
That's a regular thing. It's a very hotly contested issue. It's very hotly contested. Hopefully by early next month we can pilot the questionnaire out in the field to see people understand it. This is just the first pilot, a couple of pilots, and so we'll be in the field piloting the questionnaire countrywide to see people even understand what we're talking about.
All right. Well, we want to thank you for coming in and for dissecting the numbers with us, and more importantly, have us understand the stories behind the numbers and what it means for Belize. So thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you for
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of the Belize Olympic and Commonwealth Games Association. So stay tuned.